Hello, my name is Benjamin Tan, and I'm the Securities and Education course, i.e. the SEC co-lead lecturer. SEC is student-led course run by the Investment Society, and welcome to the SEC Winter Special, which is the 20-minute condensed bite-sized version of the lecture for you to brush up on your knowledge in the winter holiday.
Hello, my name is Sebastian Stewart, and I'm the co-lead lecturer along with Ben. The SEC is a finance lecture series based on the CFA Level 1, covering a range of topics ranging from equities to real estate to FX and many more. This lecture series is ideal for beginners as well as advanced and intermediate students. We hope you enjoy listening to the podcast as much as we enjoyed delivering the lectures. Thank you for all those who attended the course this year. We had a record level of registration and hope to welcome more of you next year.
Hello, my name is Lois, and I am the co-producer of IIIP. This lecture is part of the Macroeconomics series conducted by the SEC team, but due to the winter break, I will distribute this lecture. So here we go. The field of economics is divided into two sections, namely microeconomics and macroeconomics. Macroeconomics considers the economy at a country and international level, looking at policy decisions made by governments and central banks. Typical topics involve inflation, interest rate, economic growth, and employment. First topic is aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the total amount of spending on goods and services produced in an economy during a period of time. It can be thought as a gross domestic product, which stands for GDP, which is a measure of the market value of all the final goods and services produced by and sold by a country in a specific period. In microeconomics, we consider the demand for one good and service. Here we are just scaling the concept up. Instead of one good or service, we consider all goods and services in the economy. Once again, the law of demand applies, and the aggregate demand curve is shaped exactly like an ordinary demand curve. This time, consider a graph. X-axis represents total output, and we use a symbol of Y. Total output is also correlated with the level of employment and economy. The Y-axis represents price level and, loosely speaking, inflation, and we use the symbol of P. Aggregate demand be broken down into separate components: consumption, investment, government spending, and net trade. The largest component of aggregate demand is consumption. Consumption largely depends on disposable income. Higher levels of disposable income led to greater consumption as individuals can afford to buy higher quantities of goods and services at higher prices. Another important factor affecting consumptions is interest rates. In macroeconomics, interest rates refer to the cost of borrowing. It also refers to saving. Interest rates are managed by central banks and are crucial to managing the economy and will be explored later when we discuss the monetary policy. Theoretically, interest rates can be thought of the opportunity cost of holding money. If you store money under your bed, you are forgiving the interest rate of the return on any other asset. Nothing that return can be negative or positive. Anyway, the important thing to note here is that interest rates should be thought of as the cost of borrowing. So high interest rate would mean a higher cost of borrowing, meaning that credit becomes expensive and saving more attractive, leading to a decrease in consumption and decrease in aggregate demand. Investment refers to capital expenditure undertaken by firms to add their capital inventory. Government spending largely depends on condition of the economy. During times of recessions, such as a COVID lockdown, the government was forced to increase its welfare spending on unemployment benefits, grants, and bailouts. In addition to welfare spending, there is public sector service spending, for example, increasing fund of the health service. These types of spending programs by government aren't entirely funded by taxes. Often, it would involve monetary policy such as quantitative easing. Finally, net trade affects aggregate demand. This depends on numerous factors including exchange rates, the state of the world economy, degrees of protectionism, and consumer demand. Next topic is aggregate supply. We can extrapolate the supply we looked at earlier to encompass every goods and service in economy, and we would get aggregate supply. Remember that supply is looked at from a firm perspective, not the consumer. So aggregate supply is the total value of output that firms are willing and able to supply at a given point of time. Unlike aggregate demand, there are two types of aggregate supply curves: short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply. This is because the ability of firms to change production levels differs when we consider different time frames. Suppose you own a car firm. In the short run, your ability to change the number of cars you produce would largely depend on the cost of production. If energy prices increase overnight, it is likely your supply may slightly decrease. On the other hand, if energy prices went down, it is unlikely that you would be able to increase your production by a meaningful quantity. Hence, short-run aggregate supply, the ability for firms to vary output is limited, and short-run aggregate supply can only shift due to a change in cost of production. Suppose energy prices went down and you used the excess capital to invest in a new technology. Over the long run, this may lead to your factory being more efficient, and quantity of your cars you produce would increase noticeably. Hence, for long-run aggregate supply, the ability of firms to vary output is flexible. This difference leads to two differently shaped aggregate supply curves that both still follow the law of supply. Interestingly, there are multiple types of long-run aggregate supply curves, and the interested reader should Google about classical and Keynesian views of aggregate supply. As macroeconomic policy is largely associated with the long run, we will mainly be considering the long-run aggregate supply. Once again, the y-axis represents the price level and the x-axis represents the total output and employment. Shifts in long-run aggregate supply are caused by anything that increases the quantity or quality of resources used to produce goods and services. Technological advances can increase productivity of supply chains and help decrease the cost per unit while also attracting new firms into the market. Education and skills improvements can make workers more efficient and increase the quality of the labor force, thus enabling more goods and services to be produced and increasing the aggregate supply in the economy. Finally, changes in government policy. This can include fiscal policy such as taxes and welfare spending, or monetary policy such as interest rates and financial market interventions. Now let's move on to inflation. If you were not sleeping under a rock, you may have noticed that the price of almost everything has increased. Food, fuel, transportation, entertainment, and rent have all significantly risen in price. Undoubtedly, you must have felt that a pound today does not stretch as far as a few years ago. This is inflation, sustained rise in general price level over time. Very high rates of inflation do indeed make everyone poorer, as the cost of living increases and the purchasing power of money decreases. Another negative consequence of high inflation is that it disrupts the business planning by discouraging capital investment and disgrading business confidence. One of the most important consequences of inflation, and what is extremely topical, is the concept of a wage price spiral. As inflation rises, workers demand higher wages. For example, transport staff have been striking in demand for higher wages. If employers do indeed decide to increase wages, This can lead to inflation spiraling out of control as higher incomes will further increase consumptions and demand in the economy, putting further pressure on prices. However, some inflation is a good thing. To illustrate this, we can consider the opposite inflation, deflation, which is a decrease in price level over the time. The most notable example of this is Japan, which has had decades of extremely low or negative rates of inflation. If price of goods and services were continuously decreasing, you may think this is a good, right? Everything is getting cheaper. But this is disastrous for the economy, as you as a consumer are likely to delay your spending choices. For example, that TV you are thinking of buying, well, why not wait a couple of months and you could get it at a lower price? This can be extrapolated to firms wanting to make the investment decisions. For example, building new factories or researching new technologies. Delayed spending decisions decrease the aggregate demand in the economy and reduce overall output. Firms are less likely to invest into new technologies and the economy stagnates. Overall low and stable inflation is a positive for economy. In the UK, the target inflation rate set by government is 2%, and it is managed by the Bank of England. Low and stable inflation is often a consequence of sustainable growth and a healthy macroeconomic environment. The most quoted measure of inflation is a percentage change in CPI, which stands for Consumer Price Index. CPI measures price levels in economy by considering the price changes of basket of goods and services. What goods are in the basket are determined by a national agency, and in the UK this is ONS, which stands for Office for National Statistics. You may be wondering that it is subjective which goods should be in the basket and how they should be weighted. You are correct. One of the limitations of CPI is that it is difficult to define typical consumption. Another drawback of CPI is that it doesn't include mortgage interest payments, and that the CPI is slow to react to new inclusions in the basket. To resolve this, there is another measure of price level called RPI, which stands for Retail Price Index, which does include mortgage payments and is based on a different basket of goods. Furthermore, the RPI covers a smaller range of households, meaning it aims to target the average household. Having said this, the CPI is a more useful indicator to measure policy effectiveness due to its tried and tested calculation methods and its worldwide adoption, making it helpful in performing international comparisons. A very important extension of CPI is core CPI. The normal CPI reading, often called headline inflation, includes all parts of the economy which experience inflation and is not adjusted to remove volatile readings that are not caused by changes in economic conditions, such as food and energy prices, which can exhibit extensive volatility due to climate variances, political turmoil, natural disasters. Core CPI removes these volatile components from basket of goods and services. This is demanded as a better measure of economic conditions and is used by central banks as a barometer for policy decision making. Now, since we have both learned aggregate supply and demand, we can use both supply and demand to illustrate the cause of inflation. The first type is demand pull inflation, where the aggregate demand has shifted out, raising prices and output of the economy. One of the good examples is the recovery after COVID lockdowns. When restaurants, entertainment, and travel opened again, there were big increases in consumer spending for these goods and services. Furthermore, as consumption is the largest component of aggregate demand, it is likely that there would be a significant increase in aggregate demand. At the same time, when we had an increase in consumptions, we also had increases in the government spending. The government was forced to increase welfare payments to ensure people could survive despite not going to the work. This excessive government spending creates more credit, which means money, in the economy and further increases in aggregate demand. There is also a cost-push inflation. The second cause of inflation is a cost-push inflation. Here, the root cause is on the supply side and more specifically, decreasing supply. This is often due to rising costs of production. This might be indicative of the current situation where the war in Eastern Europe has led to surging commodity prices and raw material costs for the firms. As these costs increase, firms are restricted in the quantity of goods and services they can provide, and hence aggregate supply decreases. Rising energy prices are not the only reason that aggregate supply has been decreasing. Supply-side problems are present across the world due to many reasons such as lockdowns in Asia, the inability of firms to find workers in the transportation or shipping industry in the US, and rising interest rates. You may be wondering, aren't we currently experiencing demand pull inflation and cost push inflation? Yes, we are. We can put both these on the same diagram to truly understand the current macroeconomic environment. If everybody wants more goods and services, the aggregate demand will increase, and if firms decrease their supplies due to lack of resources, the price of the whole economy will rise. This has caused a huge increase in prices as reflected by globally high inflation levels with moderate increase in output and employment. This makes sense as the economies are recovering from pandemic where GDP and employment fell tremendously. Currently, the big problem is high inflation. To tackle this, we will look at government policy. We have seen that aggregate demand and long-run aggregate supply curves can be used to effectively portray the macroeconomic environments. The market forces on their own dictate several important economic factors such as GDP, employment, and inflations. These factors in turn have huge knock-on effects on our everyday lives via quantity quality of goods and we consume, cost of living, quality of life, and household incomes. If left to their own devices, market forces can sometimes create situations that are unfavorable to economy. So how can economies artificially control aggregate demand and long-run aggregate supply to ensure that situations like these are minimized? The answer is government policy. More specifically, a government can intervene to influence the markets via fiscal policy and the monetary policy. So, start with the fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is the manipulation of aggregate demand in the economy via changes in taxations or government spending. It can also have supply-side effects and used to improve education, health, or redistribution of income. To see this in action, we can consider the fiscal policy response of the UK government to COVID pandemic. In March 2020, the government implemented several policies that included social distancing, shutting down of shops, travel restrictions, and etc. that led to a serious downturn in the UK economy. This was a situation where aggregate demand had severely decreased, people weren't buying much, so consumption decreased, business weren't investing, and overall the economy was contracting. Consequently, a policy needed to be adopted that increased aggregate demand. We need to think of components of aggregate demand, remembering that consumption accounts for around 70% of total aggregate demand. Naively speaking, we need a policy that can get more money into the hands of people, hoping that they will spend it and in turn increase the economic activity. The UK government attempted to do this by increasing welfare payments. This policy aimed to increase the consumption and government spending components of aggregate demand. Also, the government pledged to spend £1 billion on grants for firms committing to innovation, aiming to increase the investment components. These measures are examples of fiscal policy trying to influence the market and boost the aggregate demand. Note that the fiscal policy has a time lag, meaning there is a delay between when policy is introduced and when its effects can be seen in the market. Furthermore, there can be unintended consequences. For example, what if extra credit in the economy was not spent on goods and services, but was instead saved for the future use? This concept is called a multiplier, and interested reader should look up marginal propensity to save, marginal propensity to consume. The more interesting intervention is monetary policy. While sometimes governments play a role in this, largely monetary policy is driven by central banks. In the UK, this is the Bank of England, while in US it is Federal Reserve, and in Europe it is European Central Bank. The primary tool behind monetary policy is interest rates. As discussed earlier, interest rates should be thought of as the cost of borrowing. But how do interest rates affect aggregate demand and long-run aggregate supply, and consequently the overall economy? Well, in many ways. Firstly, we will consider the impact of decreasing interest rates on aggregate demand. Low interest rates encourage consumer borrowing. As the saying goes, money is cheap. Every form of loan becomes cheaper, from car loans to bank loans to credit card loans. Overall, there is more credit in the economy and disposable incomes for households to increase. In turn, consumption of goods and services increases. At the same time, saving becomes less attractive, further increasing consumptions. Simultaneously, as interest rates fall, mortgage payments decrease, and this can trigger housing booms as more people can afford the monthly payment and demand for housing increases. From business perspective, borrowing costs decrease. This encourages investment as loans for big capital projects come at lower premiums. Finally, and usually, a fall in interest rates typically leads to a depreciation in a country's currency in foreign exchange markets. This means imports become more expensive while exports seem cheaper. Overall, interest rates have a wide-ranging effect on the economy, and this is what makes monetary policy so powerful. Unlike fiscal policy, which largely has targeted effects, interest rates affect so many different groups of economy through many different channels and can lead to more coordinated response when intervening in the markets. Interest rates also have supply-side effects and can influence long-run aggregate supply. For example, low and stable interest rates may encourage firms to invest through big capital projects as they can obtain relatively cheaper financing. In the long run, this can lead to improved efficiency and lower costs for firms, meaning that long-run aggregate supply can increase. Here, we explain the situation where interest rates were decreasing and this typical policy undertaking during times of economic slowdown. Drop in interest rates to historic lows of 0.1% by Bank of England to try and boost the economic activity during the pandemic 2020. Interestingly, there are a series of spikes from early 2022 this year where rates have suddenly shot up and are currently 2.25%. Why have interest rates gone up so much and so much quickly? The current macro environment is dominated by high inflation. This is due to the demand pull and cost push factors that were explained earlier. To reduce the inflation, central banks have been raising interest rates at unprecedented speed. This is the form of a contradictory monetary policy where the aim is to tighten financial conditions by making money more expensive to borrow. In theory, this has the reserve effect of those outlined earlier, leading to a decrease in aggregate demand and reducing the inflationary pressures. Another form of monetary policy is quantitative easing. This is performed in times of economic downturn and typically occurs in conjunction with a decrease in interest rates. Here, a central bank starts buying up bonds issued by a government. Do you remember the increased welfare spending we mentioned earlier? Well, think about it. How does the government obtain the money to execute such large spending programs? It is debt. More specifically, government bonds which are issued by institution in return for coupon payments and return of principal at some maturity date in the future. So in quantitative easing, central banks buy up these government bonds, in time driving the price of bonds higher. As the prices of these bonds increase, their yield decreases. This yield can be thought of as an interest rate and is often the benchmark interest rate used on many loans. These lower yields feed down through the economy and seek to decrease the cost of borrowing and hence increase spending and consumption in the economy. For perspective, as part of a response to the COVID pandemic, the Bank of England adopted quantitative ease program worth up to £450 billion. The reverse of quantitative easing is quantitative tightening, where central banks reduce their bond holdings. Expectedly, this has the opposite effect of quantitative easing. This time, bond prices drop and yields rise, having the ripple effect of higher interest rates and reducing the amount of spending in the economy. Currently, in response to higher inflation and a need to reverse the extensive quantitative easing programs during COVID, many central banks have been forced to start quantitative tightening, and this has led to falling bond prices across the world. In conclusion, you should now better understand macroeconomic concepts such as inflation, aggregate demand, and long-run aggregate supply. Finally, you will now appreciate the importance of interest rates and monetary policy in influencing the macroeconomic environments. Thank you for listening, and this was Louis Kim, the co-producer of Triple IP. Thank you.
Credit to our producers, Aaliyah Friedman, Louis Kim. Head of Marketing, Samhat Raman. Juniors, Ken Zhang, Angie Zhao. Head of Scriptwriting, Alfred Choi. Juniors, Aditya Mutha Kumar, Kwan Lin. Head Liaison, Lucrezia Poloni. Junior, Ekaterina Vitor. Head of Audio, Isaac Chu. Junior, Cyrus Lee. Head of Sponsorship, Sami Liu and Vladimir Dmitriev. Juniors, Leo Lee, Jamila Tabet, Utkarsh Jetli.